Hi, I'm Linda, and this is No Frills ASMR. I was listening to a podcast, as I do every day for years and years and years, and it made me think about the history of podcasts. And I don't know, a couple of years ago, I listened to an episode of the podcast. I think it was A Cup of Tea and a Chat is the name of the podcast. And they had on the ex-MTV VJ, Adam Curry. And he was talking about the birth of podcasts. And it was pretty interesting because Adam Curry, who I only knew as the MTV VJ, which is what they called them back then instead of DJ, it was Video J, VJ. Let me see, actually, I'll pull up a picture of him. But he, if you don't know, or if you do remember, he was the blonde with the big blonde hair. He may have been the very first person to even talk on the channel. I can't remember now. Let me bring up a picture. Okay, here we go. This is him. Come on. There he is. So that's Adam Curry. And he was kind of a pretty boy as a VJ, but he's super smart. I spelled his name wrong. And listening to him was very interesting. But he talked about the beginnings of podcasting, and he was working with a guy whose name was David, and I don't know how you say this, maybe Weiner. And they were working back in like 2004 on podcast. And there was a journalist whose name was Ben Hammersley, and he was the first person, I think, to like use the word podcast, maybe. I'm not totally sure about that. But Adam and David wanted to create this platform, and they made it all open source, which means anyone can use it. It's, free to everybody. And what they did is they were the first ones to make the RSS feed, and they were running it on, I guess they made a website called iPodder. And on that website, you could put in the RSS feed of your podcast you want to listen to, and then listen to it. And it was a little bit of a multi-step thing, and it was very niche at that time. Like, very few people knew about it. But Adam Curry started a podcast called The Daily Source Code. And that was sort of the original, prototype podcast. And then other people were kind of getting interested in it. And I remember at that time in my town, I had a small art gallery. And there was a guy who was going around to all the business owners and trying to talk us into starting a podcast because he had a podcast. And I remember him explaining it to me, and I was like, why? Why? Like, what would I talk about? And who would listen to it? And I just couldn't imagine that anyone would want to listen to me babble on about whatever I had to talk about. And now here I am. It just took me 20 years. Or how many years? Yeah, 20 years. Because that was in 2006. But anyway, so that was sort of the beginnings of the podcast. And then in 2005, I think Adam Curry told a story that he went to Apple and was like, look, for you new iPods, you need to have a way to listen to these podcasts. They're not music. They're, talking, and they have multi-episodes, and people are going to want to listen to the latest one. And so after he told them about it, in 2005, Apple integrated the podcast software into iTunes 4.9. And that was sort of the beginning of, well, it didn't boom right away, but it made it a lot easier for people to listen to podcasts, because now you could just go on your iPod and I can't recall. I guess you didn't. I remember it being a little bit more difficult. It wasn't like how it is now, but I don't think you had to put the RSS feed in there because you couldn't have done that. So it must have just been on there. I don't remember exactly how it worked. It wasn't as easy as now. But anyway, so in 2005, Apple added that. Now at that time, Apple wanted wanted to have it the open source and all this because they were the only ones making a device like the iPod. And so, they wanted to have all the stuff. So they had it completely and no monetization. There were no ads. No monetization. I don't know how to spell that word. And there were no ads. It was just a free service with your iPod that no one knew about and no one listened to. That's not true. There were some people, but it was pretty small back then. But it was starting to grow. And once it kind of got onto Apple, then you started to see more diversification of shows. So there started to be more tech shows and comedy. Obviously, there's always going to be politics and religion. So then they start to get more and more podcasts coming into the fold, So that's really kind of the beginning history of podcast. For a lot of people, their first experience with a podcast was during what they kind of call the third wave. And that was during the 2010 to 2014 era. And mostly that was because of a very specific podcast called Serial. And I think for a lot of people, that was their entrance into podcasts. But before that, there was the first wave of podcasting, which was like 2004 to 2006. And during that time, you had Daily Source Code. You had, in 2005, Ricky Gervais started a podcast. There was a podcast called Twit, The Dawn and Drew Show. So there were some early podcasts that were pretty popular. And then came the second wave, which were from like 2006 to 2010. And some of the big shows in this era were like comedy and entertainment. That's when those kind of shows really started to take off. Comedy and entertainment. And some of those shows are Never Not Funny, which was an early podcast and has now been around for almost 20 years. WTF with Mark Maron, and he has just announced he's going off the podcast air because he works a lot, I think. Comedy Bang Bang. These are some of the comedy ones that I listen to. But yeah, so comedy and entertainment really started to do well during this time. And then comes the third wave. And what happens during the 2010 to 2014 and onward is monetization. So once there's money to be made, then networks get involved. And really mainstream networks too started to get involved. So you have networks that are being created. And then you have like mainstream networks like ABC, CBS start publishing podcasts. And because of Serial, a lot of them were true crime. So then you start having more and more true crime. So you have Serial, Welcome to Night Vale was one. And there was like other stuff too. There was The Nerdist. That one took off. And, Joe Rogan probably started. Actually, I don't know what year Joe Rogan started. I'm not really sure, but I would assume by 2014. I should look that up. But what Joe Rogan did, he started his podcast and it got a huge following. And then he sold it himself, the brand, to Spotify for like $1 billion or something. I forget. But so that was like a big deal in podcasting. But then after 2014, I think at 2016? Yeah. So after 2014, more and more people were getting into podcasting. And then like in 2016, I think is when My Favorite Murder started. I don't know how I happened to listen to like the second episode of My Favorite Murder. And so I listened from like the very beginning, but I kind of burnt out a little ways. Like I don't know, I listened for a couple of years. I think every now and then I'll go back, listen to an episode. But now, in more modern day, there's money in podcasting if you're a celebrity. So all the big celebrities have started podcasts and they have an instant following and can make a lot of money. But I think the smaller podcasts, like No Frills ASMR is a podcast, and they don't, like, I'm not even monetized at all. Like, there's no money to be made. I shouldn't say that. I suppose if you posted I don't know if there is or not, but I don't think so. There's not a lot. But like people like, Conan O'Brien, he starts a podcast. It's immediately a hit. Amy Poehler has one right now. And what's her name? Julia Louis-Dreyfus just started a podcast. That's a hit. All the political people. I don't know. It's just like now it's all celebrity. Celebrity gets you into the networks. And the networks they push your podcast. So there's a lot of money in podcasts now. And I'm not saying they're bad podcasts. It's just the way it is. It's just different. It's not like a niche thing anymore. Now it's big. But if you go to like any of the podcast apps, all the big names are people you recognize. Just about. It's not a lot of like, here's something interesting we think you might like. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's different. It's different than it used to be for sure. But there are podcasts that I have listened to since day one. I mean, since as far as I've been listening. And it's kind of nice. You have like your friends in podcasting. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. I was so fascinated when I learned that Adam Curry was like the podfather. That's what they call him. The podfather. I never knew that until he was on this one podcast. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So he not only had one of the very early podcasts, but he also kind of helped create it. But I do love podcasts. It's how I get a lot of the information, or ideas at least. I'll hear something and go, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think I'll do a podcast. I mean, a video on it. Some of the podcasts I listen to let me think. Pretty often I listen to, I definitely listen to Never Not Funny. That's every week. I listen to Kate Casey a lot, not always a lot. I forget, there's more to her name of her podcast. The Incredible. I think it's called The Incredible Kate Casey. I listen to crime writers they just talk about shows that are about crime and whether they liked them and whatever. So I do like them, but not always, just sometimes. I listen to, what else? I'm thinking. What else do I listen to a lot? Bum, bum, bum. It's funny, I can't. A lot of times there's like a true crime thing comes up and I'll listen to it. But it's just for like a few weeks or something. But these are more like on every week. Casey might be with an E. I don't know. Casey. What else? It's funny because I listen to podcasts all the time. Well, I listen to Up First pretty often. That just gives you a little news. So you know what's going on. Sometimes I'll listen to The Daily, but not very often, but occasionally. It kind of goes on a deep dive. I do occasionally listen to either Joe Rogan, depending on who he is on, or No Rogan. And that's a pretty good one because they listen to Joe Rogan and then kind of break it down a little bit and fact check it. And they don't like hate on Joe. They actually kind of like Joe, but they're pretty good. The No Rogan podcast. What else? I would call them skeptics. They are very skeptic. As am I think. What else? I would listen to A Cup of Tea and a Chat. But they put their thing behind a paywall. And I'll probably pay for it again sometime soon, but I haven't lately. But that is Bean from K-Rock and Allie. I love them. But what else? I'm trying to think what else I listen to. I don't know. I can't think of anything else, even though I'm sure there are more. Probably as soon as